Join me on this journey as we explore the Ma and Pa, also known as the Maryland and Pennsylvania Terminal Railroad building that's abandoned. Why was it abandoned? What happened to this place? Why did it decay? What's going on with it now? All these questions will be answered throughout this video. I forgot to add this in the video. If you happen to know what kind of trains these are, please let me know in the comment section down below. I will reply. Thank you so much. In this section, we're going to talk about how the Ma and Pa Railroad formed. The Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad, effectively known as the Ma and Pa, connected Baltimore and York, Pennsylvania over a continuous 77-mile route. Wow. Its earliest predecessor, the Maryland Central Railroad, was chartered in Maryland in 1867 for the purpose of building a Baltimore to Pennsylvania line via Bel Air and Cottowingo, but laid no tracks. Joe Keene, a civil engineer with CSX Systems, felt that the straight part of the Thomas Run Road was the original grade for this intended line. For the first actual construction on the route of the Ma and Pa began in Pennsylvania with the Peach Bottom Railroad, which completed a narrow gauge line from York through Red Lion and Delta to Peach Bottom on the Susquehanna River between 1873 and 1876. This line was intended to be the middle diversion of a larger narrowed gauge railroad connecting the eastward top coal fields of central Pennsylvania with Philadelphia, but no tracks was built west of York, nor did the railroad succeed in crossing the Susquehanna River to connect with the few miles of track that were constructed on the east side. The rural Maryland County northeast of Baltimore had to wait for several more years before it received the benefit of rail service. Ouch, that hurts. Three more companies followed the lead of the Maryland Central, obtaining charters to construct a railroad northeast from Baltimore, but failing to build any tracks. Ouch. Finally, in 1878, William Waters and other businessmen from Harford County consolidated charters of several of these failed companies to form the Baltimore and Delta Railway. Their goal was a modest one: a local rail line that would carry milk and other agriculture products to markets in Baltimore and several the Delta slate quarries, because the promoters of the B&D hoped for interchange traffic with the Peach Bottom Railroad at Delta. They followed its lead and built a narrow gauge line in 1882. The B&D began operation from Baltimore to Towson, and that same year merged into the still existent Maryland Central Railroad, which completed a line through Bel Air to Delta in 1884. Despite some financial difficulties, the Maryland Central in 1887 erected a substantial stone station at Oak Street and North Avenue in Baltimore. With the cooperation of the Maryland Central, the two narrow gauge railroads began to interchange traffic at Delta. By 1889, the Maryland Central had gained control of the Pennsylvania line, and through line train service between Baltimore and York was inherited. 2 years later, the lines were merged to form the Baltimore and Lee Railroad, with headquarters in Baltimore. By this time, it had become apparent that the future of the narrow gauge railroads was bleak, and the Baltimore and Lee all entered into a contract to convert the railroad into a standard gauge. By the company was under capitalization, however, and was driven into bankruptcy. by the Depression of 1893. The Maryland and Pennsylvania sections of the B&O were sold at separate receiver auctions. The northern end was purchased by Warren Wolof of Cleveland, who organized the York Southern Railroad, while the southern end was controlled by John Wilson Brown, members of a prominent Baltimore banking family, who formed the Baltimore and Lee Railroad. The York Southern had better freight prospers and stronger financially, which permitted Wolof to produce and conversion of the lines to standard gauge. The conversion was completed in 1895, and the York Southern began to interchange freight cars with the Pennsylvania Railroad in York. Also in this period, a short branch from the mainland near York and Dellistown was built. The weaker Baltimore and Lee continued to operate as a narrow gauge line until 1901, when it contracted with the Stanford and Brooks Company to accomplish the conversion. During most of this period, there was healthy hospitality between the two railroads, and no direct connections were offered in Delta. In 1899, control of the York Southern was purchased by Stephen Jones and Company of Baltimore. With both lines controlled by Baltimore interests, the stage was set for the final consolidation of the line. The unification was effected by the investment banking firm of Alexander Brown and Company, which bought control over the B&L in the early 1901s. A plan of the merger was developed and accepted by the stockholders of the B&L and the York Southern, who exchanged their shares for shares in their newly formed Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad. The new company was firmly in the hands of the Maryland interests. 7 of these 9 directors included John Wilson Brown, Alexander Brown, and John Cohen, general consultant of the B&O, from Baltimore. John Wilson Brown was named president of the line. With this new management came access to Baltimore capital markets for improvement of the line and continued relationships with Maryland Trust Company and Merchants Trust and Deposit Company, which served as trustees for the company bonds. These relationships with the Baltimore financial community provided a stability that allowed the Ma and Pa to weather the Great Depression without falling into bankruptcy. With unification came the existent period of the prosperous for the Ma and Pa. In the earlier years, more than half of the company's revenue came from passenger mail and express. These services were heavily concentrated in the Maryland district from the beginning. The core of the passenger service was 2 northbound trains and 2 southbound mail trains that ran the length of the railroad. There was also a daily York and Delta round trip, but in Maryland, an early morning train would come from Delta, brought great quantities of milk into the city, and many local trains operated between Bel Air and Baltimore. At the peak of the service, Bel Air had 16 trains a day, providing commuter services and late night returning from theater goers. Large quantities of express were handled, especially at Bel Air and Towson. The railroad promoted the recreational possibilities along its route, and many city dwellers took their families on Sunday outings to Loch Raven and the rocks of the Deer Creek. Passenger traffic totaled about 3 million passenger miles annually. Investing total for a railroad on which the average trip consistently did not exceed 30 miles. The trains were a central feature of life for the agriculture communities all along these lines. Freight before World War I consisted primarily of agriculture goods moving to markets from stations such as Fulton and Woodbine. Full carloads of milk were moved daily. Wheat was shipped to markets from local grain elevators such as those at Bellaire and Muddy Creek Forks, and coronaries as many stations, including Hay, Blurm, and High Rock, were a substantial source of traffic. Despite seasonal nature and the current business, 12% of freight revenue in 1907 came from coronary shipments. The balance of freight, organization, and the line of slate from Delta and late manufactured goods from Red Lion and Dellistown. Incoming shipments were primarily coal, fertilizer, and less than carload shipments of goods to merchants along the route. Although the railroad is slowing substantially operations suppliers, it paid no dividends, preferring to improve its facilities. Numerous locomotives and passenger cars were purchased to handle the booming business. All the bridges and trestles were straightened, heavy rails was installed, and the major wood trestles between Baltimore and Bellaire was replaced with steel verdicts. New stations were built at Fulton, Baldwin, Glenarm, and Forest Hill, where the original station in the Row and Trucker General Store was destroyed by a fire. Major truck relocators in the made between the Little Gunpowder River and the Laurel Brook in Harford County, and just north of Laurel on the Pennsylvania District to reduce excessive curvature. In 1907, the railroad began a major expansion of its Baltimore terminal facility building. Over the next few years, a direct connection to Baltimore and Ohio railroads, a new yard, tracks, excluding coal docks, a large stone roundhouse, and a shop which still stands along Falls Road, and a new freight station. The Ma and Pa served almost no industrial suppliers in Baltimore. Its line ran through residential areas, but the city was, undoubtedly, its center of operations. The railroad general officers were in Baltimore. All trains dispatch was located there, and equipment maintenance was centered in the city, in Baltimore shops. The Ma and Pa did all the maintenance for its 16 active steam locomotives, maintenance at its passenger cars, and built many of its own freight cars. At the peak in 1913, the Ma and Pa had 573 employees, with a great construction in Baltimore. In this section, we're going to talk about the downfall of the Ma and Pa. After World War I, the pattern of traffic on railroads began to change, with improving roads and more passenger car traffic dropping rapidly. Ouch. By 1936, passenger trains operations had fallen to 10% of railroad revenues. That's gotta hurt. Service was reduced to the mail trains, and the passengers that remained were mostly in Pennsylvania, where there was no roads paralleled the railroad throughout the Muddy Creek village. Milk and less than carloads freights were lost to trucks, and coal revenue decreased as fewer homes used coal for heating. Yeah, that's gotta hurt. Manufactured goods from Red Lion and York and slate from Delta and Whiteford became the mainstay of the railroad. With these changes, the dominant position of the Maryland district began to fade. In 1935, the Ma and Pa became a pioneer in a new type of railroad operations that was never a significant source of revenue, but brought international and national fame to the line. Under the sponsorship of Baltimore Society of Model Engineers, and the Ma and Pa ran its first real fan excursion. Woohoo! The trip was coordinated by A-M- Bastras, traffic manager of the Ma and Pa. President O-H.A.A.M. Bastras, traffic manager of the Ma and Pa. President O-H.A.M. Bastras, traffic manager of the Ma and Pa. Friends O and H. Nancy made the trip himself, catering to the whims of the rail fans with photo stops and rail and rides of the cab of the steam locomotive. Now that's cool. Many other rail fans' excursions followed over the next dozen years, including NRHS sponsors circle trips from Pennsylvania over the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Mott and Pop. As these result of excursions and the press covered they received, the Mott and Pop became one of the best known short lines in the United States, famous for its beautiful scenery and its unique equipment. By the 1950s, passengers had dwindled to about 12% train. It was clear that only the government contract for operating the railroad, post office cars, were keeping the passenger trains going. In 1953, the postal contract was lost to the tracking company, and on August 31st, the last passenger train ran. Freight traffic on the Maryland district had declined to an extent that throughout freight trains were no longer run. Ouch. Daily service between York and Delta was supplemented by trains as needed from Baltimore that ran only as far as north as train traffic required. In 1958, the Maryland district was abandoned and the Ma and Pa moved its office to York. The Pennsylvania district served for another 2 decades. Slates and greens marbles from Delta and Clifford, furnitures and manufactured goods from Red Line and Dallastown, and switching to many industrials along the line, in York permitting operations to break even level. In the late 1960s, construction of the Peach Bottom nuclear power plant brought a significant temporary increase in traffic. The fate of the Pennsylvania district was sealed by the end of the slate quarrying the Delta in 1971. The last revenue train in Whiteford ran in 1978 and served the Red Line was ended in 1984. The Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad served as a switching railroad in York and now operates to Hanover over a former railroad right-of-way, but the current company has little in common with the historic Ma and Pop. In 1986 and 1987, the track of the original Pennsylvania district south of York was dismantled. Only 8-mile segment between Laurel and Bridgeton was left in plain. These sections was required by the Maryland and Pennsylvania Railroad Preservation Society, which has since labored to restore its operational condition in hopes of returning the excursion train to the Muddy Creek Village. In this section, we're going to talk about the abandoned part. The abandoned part. Passenger service was discontinued on August 31st, 1954, and the section from Baltimore to Whiteford, Maryland, just south of the Mason-Dixon line, disclaiming the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, was abandoned in June of 1958. Most of the remaining parts of the original railroad line was abandoned by 1984. In this section, we're going to be talking about the decaying part. My guess could be homeless people, vandals, and scalpers have been taking stuff from the building and have breaking into it. As I was doing this video, I actually saw somebody spray painting the building. That's not cool. In this section, we're going to talk about what's going on with it right now and who owns it. Currently, the Baltimore Streetcar Museum owns the building, but they don't take care of it. That's why it looks abandoned. Thanks for watching my video. Make sure to subscribe to my channel, like the video, and also don't forget to hit the notification button so you'll know when new videos get released.